Clara Nguyen wasn't the kind of girl who liked being noticed. At 28, she'd built a quiet little life for herself in the suburbs of Chicago, working as a barista at Brew Haven, a cozy coffee shop tucked between a laundromat and a used bookstore. She loved the smell of roasted beans, the soft hum of the espresso machine, and the way she could fade into the background while pouring lattes. People came and went, chatting about their lives, but Clara, she kept her head down, her dark hair falling over her face like a curtain, hiding the shy girl who'd rather be lost in a novel than making small talk. It was a freezing December morning when everything changed. Clara had been in the shower, steam fogging up the tiny bathroom, when her fingers brushed against something odd, a small, hard lump just under the skin of her left breast. Her heart stopped. She stood there, water pounding against her back, staring at the tiled wall as panic clawed its way up her throat. It's probably nothing, she told herself, wrapping a towel around her trembling body, but the thought wouldn't leave her alone. For days she ignored it, pretending she hadn't felt a thing. She wasn't the type to rush to a doctor. Hospitals freaked her out, and the idea of someone poking at her made her stomach twist. Her best friend Mia wouldn't let it slide, though. Mia was everything Clara wasn't. Bold, loud, the kind of girl who'd flirt with customers just to see them blush. They'd been working together at Brewhaven for 2 years, and Mia had a knack for dragging Clara out of her shell, whether she liked it or not. That afternoon, as they wiped down counters during a slow shift, Mia caught Clara rubbing her chest absent-mindedly. "What's up with you?" she asked, tossing a rag over her shoulder. Clara froze, her cheeks burning. "Nothing," she mumbled, turning away. But Mia wasn't buying it. She grabbed Clara's arm, her voice dropping. "Spill it, or I'm not letting you hide back there with the coffee grinder." Clara sighed, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. I felt something in my chest last week." Mia's eyes widened, but she didn't miss a beat. "You're going to a doctor tomorrow. I'll drag you there myself if I have to." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but Mia cut her off. "No excuses. If it's something bad, you need to know early. You're not invincible, Clara." The next day, Clara found herself in the waiting room of a private clinic downtown. Mia had insisted on coming along, sitting beside her with a magazine she wasn't really reading. The place smelled like antiseptic, sharp and cold, and the faint beep of machines down the hall made Clara's skin crawl. She clutched her coat tight, her knuckles white. "What if it's a guy doctor?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mia rolled her eyes. "So what? It's their job. They've seen it all. You'll be fine." Easy for her to say, Clara thought. Mia could walk into any room like she owned it. Clara, though? She'd spent her whole life avoiding anything that made her feel exposed, and now here she was, about to let a stranger check the most private part of her. Her heart was pounding so loud she swore Mia could hear it. Every cough, every shuffle of feet in the waiting room felt like it was closing in on her. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to know, but deep down, buried under all that fear, was a tiny voice telling her Mia was right. If something was wrong, she couldn't keep pretending it wasn't there. The nurse called her name. "Clara Nguyen?" And her stomach dropped. This was it. Clara's legs felt like jelly as she followed the nurse down the sterile hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the white walls. She kept her eyes on the floor, counting the tiles to steady her breathing. Anything to keep her mind off what was coming. Mia had stayed in the waiting room, giving her a thumbs up like this was some kind of adventure. To Clara, it felt more like walking into a lion's den. The nurse stopped at a door, gave her a quick smile, and said, "Dr. Voss will be right with you." Then she was gone, leaving Clara alone in the exam room. The space was small but pristine, a padded table in the center, a desk with a computer in the corner, and posters about breast health plastered on the walls. Clara hugged herself, the chill of the room sinking into her bones. She'd imagined some grumpy old doctor with a clipboard, someone who'd rush through this and send her on her way. That's what she'd braced herself for. But when the door swung open a minute later, everything she'd prepared for flew out the window. Standing there was a man who couldn't have been older than 35. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair swept back just enough to look effortless. His white coat hung over a crisp shirt, and his deep green eyes locked onto her with a calm, steady gaze. He was, well, gorgeous in a way that made Clara's throat go dry. "Good afternoon, Miss Nguyen," he said, his voice smooth and warm like he was greeting an old friend. "I'm Dr. Ethan Voss. I'll be taking care of you today." He flashed a small, professional smile that somehow made her feel even smaller. Clara couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her face burned as she stared at him, her mind screaming, "This is the doctor?" She'd been terrified of a man examining her, but this was worse. He wasn't just a man, he was the kind of guy who'd turn heads walking down the street, and now he was about to... Oh God. She forced her eyes to the floor, clutching her coat tighter. "Hi," she managed to squeak out, barely audible. Ethan didn't seem fazed by her awkwardness. He stepped closer, clipboard in hand, and she caught a faint whiff of his cologne, something crisp and expensive. "I know these visits can feel a little overwhelming," he said gently, his tone so reassuring it almost made her relax. "Almost, but I promise I'll make this as easy as possible." "Mind if I ask you a few questions first?" Clara nodded, still avoiding his gaze. He pulled up a stool and sat down, giving her space, which she appreciated more than he'd ever know. He started with the basics, her age, medical history, when she'd noticed the lump. Clara stumbled through her answers, her voice shaky and quiet. "About a week ago," she said, twisting her fingers in her lap. "I was, in the shower and I felt it." Her cheeks flamed at the admission, but Ethan just nodded, jotting something down like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Any pain?" he asked. "No," she whispered. "Just they." "Okay," he said, setting the clipboard aside. "I'll need to take a look, but I'll explain everything as we go. If you're uncomfortable at any point, just say so." Clara swallowed hard, nodding again. She climbed onto the exam table, her movements stiff, and lay back, squeezing her eyes shut like she could will herself invisible. Ethan's hands were gentle as he started the exam, his touch careful and precise. "Just breathe for me," he said softly, and she tried. God, she tried. But every second felt like an eternity. It didn't take long, maybe a minute, though it felt like hours to her. Ethan stepped back, his expression calm but focused. "I can feel a small mass," he said, and Clara's eyes snapped open, her heart lurching. "But don't panic. It's not uncommon. Based on its size and texture, I'd guess it's benign, maybe a fibroadenoma. We'll need an ultrasound to be sure, though." He smiled again, that same warm smile, and for a split second, Clara felt a flicker of relief. "Benign?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "Not cancerous?" Ethan nodded. "Most likely. Happens all the time in women your age. We'll set up the ultrasound to confirm." Clara exhaled, her shoulders slumping. "Not cancerous. Maybe." The words bounced around in her head as Ethan typed something into the computer. "You did great," he said, glancing back at her. "I know that wasn't easy." She managed a tiny, embarrassed smile, still reeling from the whole thing. His kindness, his voice, the way he made this nightmare feel almost bearable. "Thanks," she mumbled, sliding off the table. He handed her a slip of paper with the ultrasound appointment details. "See you soon, Clara," he said. And the way he said her name, soft, deliberate, made her stomach flip. She practically bolted out of the room, her pulse racing for reasons she couldn't quite pin down. Back in the waiting room, Mia grinned at her. "Well, how'd it go?" Clara shook her head, still dazed. "He's nice," was all she could say. Mia raised an eyebrow. "Nice, huh? That's it?" Clara didn't answer. She didn't know how to explain that Dr. Ethan Voss wasn't just nice. He was something else entirely. something she wasn't ready to face. The next few days were a blur for Clara. She went back to her routine at Brewhaven, grinding beans, steaming milk, dodging Mia's endless questions about the doctor, but her mind kept drifting back to that exam room. Dr. Ethan Voss. His steady voice, those green eyes that seemed to see right through her. She told herself it was nothing, just a dumb crush born out of nerves. He was a doctor, probably used to patients acting weird around him. Still, every time she touched her chest, feeling for that lump, his words echoed in her head. Most likely benign. She clung to that like a lifeline, even as doubt gnawed at her. It was a slow Thursday afternoon when he walked in. Clara was behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine, the shop nearly empty except for an old guy reading a newspaper in the corner. The bell above the door jingled and she glanced up, then froze. Ethan Voss stood there, hands in the pockets of a dark coat, his hair slightly tousled from the wind outside. He scanned the room, and when his eyes landed on her, a slow, surprised smile spread across his face. "Clara?" he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but all that came out was a strangled, hi. Her hands fumbled with the rag, and before she knew it, she'd knocked over a stack of paper cups. They tumbled to the floor with a soft thud, and her face went beet red. "Oh, God," she muttered, dropping to her knees to pick them up. Ethan was already moving, crouching down across from her to help. "Rough day?" he asked, his tone light, teasing almost. "Something like that," she mumbled, avoiding his gaze. Their fingers brushed as they reached for the same cup, and she yanked her hand back like she'd been shocked. He chuckled, a low, warm sound that made her stomach do a weird little flip. "You don't have to be so jumpy around me," he said, stacking the cups neatly. "I'm not here to check your pulse." Clara forced a laugh, though it came out more like a squeak. "Right. What are you here for?" She stood up, brushing her apron, and he followed, towering over her in a way that made her feel tiny. "Coffee," he said simply, nodding at the menu board. "Heard this place has the best latte in town. Figured I'd see for myself." She blinked. Ethan Voss, fancy doctor, coming to her little coffee shop? It didn't add up, but she wasn't about to argue. "Okay, one latte, coming up," she said, turning to the machine before she could embarrass herself more. As she worked, she felt his eyes on her, not in a creepy way, but like he was curious. "So," he said, leaning casually against the counter, "how have you been holding up? Since the appointment, I mean." His voice softened and she nearly spilled the milk. She kept her focus on the steamer, letting the hiss drown out her nerves. "Fine," she lied, "just waiting for the ultrasound." He didn't push, just nodded. "Good. You'll be okay, Clara. I've seen a lot of cases like yours. Most turn out fine." She finished the latte, sliding it across to him with shaky hands. "Thanks," she said quietly, "for saying that." He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers again, on purpose this time, she was sure of it. "Any time," he replied, taking a sip. His eyes lit up. "Wow, this is good." Clara blushed, muttering a quick, "Glad you like it," before retreating to wipe down the counter again. He didn't leave, though. Instead, he wandered over to a table by the window, pulling out a book from his coat pocket. Clara squinted. The Night Circus, one of her favorites. She couldn't help herself. "You read that?" she asked, her voice cutting through the quiet. He looked up, surprised, then grinned. "Yeah, second time, actually. I love how it pulls you into this whole other world." Clara's guard slipped a little. "Me too," she said, stepping closer despite herself. "The way the magic feels so real, it's like an escape." Ethan's smile widened. "Exactly. You a big reader?" She nodded, relaxing into the conversation. "Huge. Books are safe, you know? Better than real life, sometimes." He tilted his head, studying her. "I get that. Reality can be A lot. There was something in his tone, a weight she didn't expect. But before she could ask, he shifted gears. "What's your favorite?" They talked for 20 minutes. Jane Austen, fantasy novels, the best coffee to pair with a good story. Clara forgot to be shy, her words spilling out easier than they ever had with a stranger. Ethan listened like he actually cared, asking questions that made her light up. "You've got good taste," he said at one point, and she ducked her head, flustered. "Thanks, you too." Then he dropped it, casual as anything. "I lost my sister to breast cancer a few years back. That's why I do what I do, why I care so much about catching it early." Clara's breath caught. She wanted to tell him about her mom, how she'd watched her fade away from the same disease, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she just said, "I'm sorry, that's awful." He shrugged, but his eyes were distant. "It was, but it keeps me going. Patients like you, they matter." The old guy in the corner left, and Mia poked her head out from the back, smirking at Clara like she'd caught her in the act. "Your shift's almost up," she called, loud enough to break the moment. Ethan glanced at his watch. "Guess I should head out too," he said, standing. He left a tip, way too generous, and paused at the door. "See you at the ultrasound, Clara. Take care, okay?" She nodded, her chest tight. "You too." When he was gone, Mia swooped in, grinning. "Who's that? He's hot. And he's into you." Clara swatted her with the rag. "He's my doctor, Mia. That's it." But as she locked up later, replaying their talk in her head, she wasn't so sure. Ethan Voss wasn't just a doctor. He was someone who got her. Someone who made her feel seen. And that scared her more than the lump ever had. Clara couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. That coffee shop conversation had lodged itself in her brain, replaying on a loop every time she steamed milk or flipped through a book. His voice, the way he'd talked about his sister, the easy way he'd pulled her out of her shell. It was messing with her head. She'd catch herself smiling at nothing, then shake it off, annoyed. "He's your doctor," she'd remind herself. Nothing more. But the ultrasound appointment loomed closer, and with it a mix of dread and something else she didn't want to name. The day arrived, gray and dreary, matching the knot in her stomach. She walked into the clinic alone this time. Mia had a shift she couldn't skip, and sat in the waiting room, twisting her scarf between her fingers. Her mom's face kept flashing in her mind, pale and tired near the end, the hospital smells clinging to every memory. What if Ethan was wrong? What if it wasn't benign? By the time the nurse called her name, her palms were sweaty, her breath shallow. Ethan was waiting in the exam room, standing by the ultrasound machine with that same calm confidence. "Hey, Clara," he said, his smile softening the edges of her nerves. "Ready to get this over with?" She nodded, forcing a weak "yeah" as she climbed onto the table. He explained the process. Cold gel, a wand thing, quick and simple. But she barely heard him over the pounding in her ears. "Just lie back," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've got you." The gel was freezing, making her flinch, and Ethan murmured, "Sorry about that. Should have warmed it up." She almost laughed, but it came out more like a huff. He moved the probe over her skin, his touch gentle but sure, and she stared at the ceiling, counting the tiles again to keep from freaking out. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the machine and the occasional click as he adjusted something. She wanted to ask what he saw, but her throat felt glued shut. After what felt like forever, he set the probe down and wiped the gel off with a cloth. "All done," he said, turning to her. His face was relaxed, no trace of worry, and Clara's heart skipped. "So?" she whispered, sitting up slowly. Ethan leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. "It's exactly what I thought, a fibroadenoma. No signs of anything malignant. You're in the clear." The words hit her like a wave, washing away the fear she'd been drowning in. "Really?" she asked, her voice cracking. He nodded, his smile widening. "Really? You're okay, Clara?" She let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping as relief flooded through her. "Oh, thank God," she muttered, running a hand through her hair. Ethan watched her, his eyes warm. "I know you've been stressed about this. You handled it like a champ." She blushed, looking down at her hands. "And feel like it." He laughed softly. "Trust me, you did." He went on, explaining her options. "Keep an eye on it every 6 months, or get it removed with a quick procedure if it bugged her. No rush to decide," he said, scribbling something on a notepad. "Think it over." Clara nodded, still processing the fact that she wasn't dying, that this wasn't her mom's story all over again. She slid off the table, feeling lighter than she had in weeks, but her scarf caught on the edge, yanking her back. She stumbled, arms flailing, and before she could hit the floor, Ethan was there. His arms wrapped around her, strong and steady, catching her mid-fall. For a split second, time stopped. Her hands grabbed his shirt, fingers curling into the fabric, and his grip tightened on her waist, holding her up. She was pressed against him, close enough to feel the warmth of his chest, the faint thud of his heartbeat. Or maybe that was hers, hammering so loud it drowned everything else out. His breath brushed her hair, and she caught that crisp cologne again, mixed with something uniquely him. Her face was inches from his, those green eyes locked on hers, and she couldn't breathe. Then reality slammed back. Clara jerked away, nearly tripping again as she disentangled herself. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her face on fire. She smoothed her shirt, her hands shaking, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. Ethan didn't flinch, though. Didn't even look rattled. He just straightened up, a tiny smirk tugging at his lips. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm, almost amused. "Yeah," she lied, staring at her shoes. "Totally fine." He tilted his head, like he could see right through her. "You sure? You look a little rattled." Her head snapped up, mortified. "I'm not rattled," she snapped, louder than she meant to. His smirk grew, but his eyes stayed soft. "If you say so." He stepped back, giving her space, and handed her a folder. "Here's the info on your options. Take your time deciding. Call me if you've got questions, okay?" She snatched it, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "Got it, thanks, bye," she blurted, bolting for the door before she could do anything else stupid. She didn't slow down until she was outside, the cold air hitting her like a slap. Her cheeks were still burning, her pulse racing, and not just from the fall. That moment, his arms around her, the way he'd looked at her, it was burned into her brain. She shook her head, trying to shove it down. "He's your doctor, Clara. That's it." But as she walked home, the folder crinkling in her grip, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something she wasn't ready for. Back at Brewhaven that night, Mia cornered her the second she walked in. "So, what's the verdict?" Clara slumped into a chair, still dazed. "It's fine, not cancer." Mia whooped, pulling her into a hug. "Told you, see? Nothing to worry about." Clara hugged her back, but her mind was somewhere else. On Ethan. On that split second when the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Yeah," she said faintly. "Nothing to worry about." Mia pulled back, squinting at her. "What's with the face? You're acting weird." Clara forced a smile. "Just tired. Long day." Mia didn't buy it, but she let it go. For now. That night, Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She should have been over the moon, relieved, free, and she was, but Ethan Voss was still there, lingering in her thoughts like a song she couldn't get out of her head. His hands on her, his voice, that stupid smirk. She groaned, rolling over and burying her face in the pillow. "Get it together," she muttered, but deep down, she knew she was in trouble. Clara thought she could put it behind her. The ultrasound, the fall, the way Ethan's arms had felt around her. She threw herself back into work at Brewhaven, pouring lattes and dodging Mia's teasing like nothing had changed. But everything had. She'd catch herself staring out the shop window, half hoping he'd walk in again, then scold herself for being ridiculous. He was her doctor. A nice guy, sure, but that was it. She wasn't the kind of girl who got swept up in fairy tales. Still, the folder he'd given her sat unopened on her kitchen counter, a quiet reminder she couldn't ignore. It was late one night, after a long shift, when the twist hit her like a punch. She was sprawled on her couch, scrolling through her phone to unwind, when a news alert popped up. Voss Medical Empire, the billionaire doctor making waves. Her thumb hovered over it, curiosity tugging at her. Voss. She clicked, and there he was. A photo of him in that white coat, smiling that same warm smile, only now it was captioned, Dr. Ethan Voss, heir to the Voss Medical Group, worth billions. Her stomach dropped. She skimmed the article, her heart racing with every word. Ethan wasn't just some random doctor. He was the only son of a healthcare dynasty, a guy who could have been sipping champagne in a penthouse but chose to work in exam rooms instead. It was noble, almost too perfect. Then came the kicker, buried halfway down the page. After the tragic loss of his fiancée, Sophia Grant, to breast cancer 5 years ago, Dr. Voss has dedicated his career to early detection. Rumors swirl that his closeness with patients stems from unresolved grief, a way to heal old wounds. There was a picture of Sophia, stunning, polished, a businesswoman who looked like she belonged in Ethan's world. Clara's phone slipped from her hands, hitting the cushion with a soft thud. Fiancé, breast cancer, rumors about patients. Her mind spun, piecing it together, or maybe tearing it apart. Was that why he'd been so kind to her? Was she just, a stand-in? A way to fix what he couldn't with Sophia? The coffee shop chat, the way he'd caught her when she fell? It all felt different now, tainted. She curled her knees to her chest, her breath hitching. She'd let herself feel something for him. And now she felt stupid, used. For days, she shut him out. Her phone buzzed with a text from him. Hey, just checking in, how you feeling? And she stared at it, her thumb hovering over the reply button before she swiped it away. Another came a day later. Ultrasound follow-up soon. Let me know if you need anything. She ignored that too. When the clinic called to confirm, she told them she'd reschedule, her voice flat. Mia noticed the shift, cornering her at work. What's up with you? You've been a ghost lately. Clara shrugged. Just busy. Mia didn't push, but her frown said she wasn't fooled. Then he showed up. It was a quiet afternoon at Brewhaven, the kind where the hours dragged. Clara was restocking sugar packets when the bell jingled, and there he was. Ethan, in a dark sweater and jeans, looking too good for her peace of mind. Her heart lurched, but she steeled herself, turning back to the counter. Hey, he said, walking up like nothing was wrong. Thought I'd grab a latte. She nodded, keeping her eyes on the espresso machine. Sure, 1 latte. He watched her work, the silence heavy between them. Clara, he said finally, his voice softer. You've been dodging me. What's going on? She froze, her hand tightening on the milk pitcher. I haven't, she lied, pouring the foam with more focus than it needed. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Come on, no texts, no calls. You blew off the follow-up. Did I do something? The concern in his tone almost broke her, but she held firm, sliding the latte across. I've been busy, that's all. Ethan didn't take it. He set the cup down, his eyes narrowing. Busy doesn't explain this. Talk to me. She couldn't dodge it anymore. He wasn't leaving without answers. Her chest tightened, anger and hurt bubbling up. Fine, she snapped, her voice low so the handful of customers wouldn't hear. I read about you. The billionaire doctor, the fiancée, Sophia. His face shifted, surprise, then something darker. Clara? He started, but she cut him off. I get it, okay? You lost her, and now you're playing savior with patients like me. I'm not her, Ethan. I don't want to be some... Some fix for your guilt." The words hung there, sharp and raw. Ethan's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with something she couldn't read. Hurt, maybe? Or frustration? "You think that's what this is?" he asked, his voice tight. "That I'm using you?" She crossed her arms, her throat burning. "Isn't it? You're this perfect guy with a perfect life, and I'm just me. It doesn't add up." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Clara, I don't see you as a patient or a replacement. I see you. And I thought you saw me too, not just some headline." Her breath caught, his words hitting harder than she expected. She wanted to believe him, but doubt clung to her like damp clothes. "I don't know what to see anymore," she said, quieter now. "We're different, Ethan. You're you, and I'm not part of that world." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "You don't get to decide what I want, Clara. I'm not here because of my last name or some ghost from my past. I'm here because of you." She stared at him, her resolve cracking. He sounded so sure, so real, but the article's words, "unresolved grief," echoed in her head. Before she could respond, Mia poked her head out from the back. "Clara, we need you. Spill on aisle 3. Clara seized the excuse, turning away. "I have to go," she muttered, brushing past him. He didn't stop her, but she felt his eyes on her as she disappeared into the stockroom. She leaned against a shelf, her hand shaking. She'd pushed him away, but it didn't feel like a win. It felt like she'd lost something, something she hadn't even realized she wanted. Ethan's voice lingered, his frustration, his insistence. Was she wrong? Or was she just too scared to find out? Outside, the rain started tapping against the windows, and Clara hugged herself, wishing she could disappear into it. She'd built her walls high, but Ethan Voss was tearing them down, and she didn't know how to stop him, or if she even wanted to. Clara couldn't shake Ethan's words. They followed her home that night, rattling around in her head as she scrubbed coffee stains off her apron. "I'm here because of you," he'd said, and it sounded so simple, so certain, but it terrified her. She'd spent days hiding from him, convincing herself she was just a footnote in his story, but the look in his eyes at Brewhaven said otherwise. She tossed her phone onto the couch, ignoring the unread texts piling up from him. She needed space, time to figure out what she felt. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It was a Friday night, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Clara's shift ran late. Some guy had spilled an entire tray of drinks, and she'd volunteered to stay and mop up so Mia could head out. By the time she locked the shop, the streets were slick with rain, the sky a heavy blanket of gray. She pulled her hood up, her sneakers splashing through puddles as she hurried toward her apartment a few blocks away. That's when she saw him. Ethan stood under the awning across the street, his dark sweater soaked through, hair plastered to his forehead. He wasn't moving, just watching her, like he'd been there for hours. Clara stopped dead, her breath fogging in the chilly air. "Ethan?" she called, her voice barely cutting through the rain. He crossed the street in a few long strides, stopping a foot away, water dripping off him. "Clara," he said, his voice rough, urgent, "we need to talk." She hugged her arms around herself, the cold biting at her skin. "What are you doing here? You're drenched." He didn't flinch, his green eyes locked on hers. "I've been trying to reach you for days. You won't answer me. I couldn't wait anymore." Her stomach twisted. Guilt, fear, something softer she couldn't name. "I told you, I've been busy," she mumbled, but it sounded weak even to her. "Clara, stop," he said, stepping closer. Rain ran down his face, but he didn't seem to care. "You're running from me, and I need to know why. If it's about that article, about Sophia, say it. Tell me I'm wrong, and I'll walk away right now." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The truth was, she didn't want him to walk away, not really. And that scared her more than anything. He took another step, close enough that she could see the rain clinging to his lashes. "I don't care about the money, the name, any of it," he said, his voice low and fierce. I don't care what you think I deserve or what world you think I'm from. I'm here, standing in the damn rain, because I love you, Clara. Not some ghost, not some idea. You. The words hit her like a shockwave, stealing her breath. She stared at him, rain blurring her vision, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. I lost my mom to this, she blurted, her voice breaking. I watched her die, and I've been so scared it had happened to me too. And then you're this perfect guy who's been through it, and I don't know how to trust that I'm not just safe for you. Tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks, and she hated how exposed she felt, but she couldn't stop. But I feel it too, Ethan. I think I love you, and it's freaking me out. His face softened, relief washing over him. He reached out, pulling her into his arms, and she didn't fight it. The rain soaked through her hoodie, but his warmth cut through the cold, grounding her. You're not safe for me, he murmured against her hair. You're everything. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing and laughing at once, and he held her tighter, like he'd never let go. Under the rain, in the middle of the empty street, they found each other. And this time, Clara wasn't running. A year later, the Chicago winter didn't feel so cold anymore. Clara stood at the entrance of a community health center, her breath visible in the crisp air, but her hands were steady, no more trembling. Beside her, Ethan squeezed her fingers, his familiar warmth a quiet anchor. She glanced up at him, catching that green-eyed smile that still made her stomach flutter, even now. They weren't just here as a couple today, they were here with a purpose. Inside, the lobby buzzed with people. Women of all ages, some nervous, like she'd once been, waiting for free breast cancer screenings. It was their project, hers and Ethan's, a way to give back, to turn their story into something bigger. Clara wasn't the shy barista hiding behind the counter anymore. She'd found her voice, step by step, with Ethan by her side. You ready? He asked, his voice soft but proud. She smiled, really smiled, and nodded. Yeah, I am. They stepped in together, hand in hand, greeting the staff and patients. Clara spotted a young woman clutching her purse, eyes darting around, and she knew that fear too well. She walked over, offering a quiet, "It's going to be okay," and meant it. Ethan watched her, his chest swelling with something that felt like forever. This was their life now, helping others heal the way they'd healed each other. Clara had walked into that clinic a year ago, terrified and alone, but she'd found more than a diagnosis. She'd found love, courage, a future. And as they worked side by side, she knew one thing for sure. Sometimes the scariest steps lead you to the best places.